Hey, thanks so much for joining us here on 9 News Plus. I'm Chris Bianchi, and they annoy you. They annoy me. They even annoy my dog, and they're seemingly annoying everyone and everything. Miller moths are taking over the Front Range. In fact, they've taken over living rooms, and this morning I even saw a video of moths all over the cockpit of a plane at Denver International Airport. But those same irritating moths are also good for the environment. So don't kill them. And for a bit more about these moths, why they're taking over your house, why they're good for the environment, and what else we should know about them, we're now joined by Sharon Hershkovich, a lepidopterist at the Butterfly Pavilion in Westminster. And by the way, a lepidopterist is someone who specializes in the studying of moths and some forms of butterflies. Sharon, did I get that right? And thanks for joining us today.
That is correct. Lepidopterist is essentially a very fancy way of saying butterfly and moth scientist.
Well, Lepidopterist right now here along the Front Range, I think it's safe to say perhaps the most unique position here along the Front Range, and maybe a bit more of a added interest in recent weeks. So I guess my first question, I hear the term Miller moth all the time. I feel like I've heard that a bunch. What exactly is a Miller moth?
A miller moth is the adult form of the army cutworm. So they, just like butterflies, complete the very interesting life cycle. They go through the metamorphosis process. They spend a good chunk of their lives as caterpillars. They pupate underground and then they emerge as the miller moths that we see today. And they are actually arriving in the Front Range as part of a very special migration that they complete every year. The miller moths, while everyone every year finds them a bit of a nuisance and an annoyance, I find them a very comforting sign of spring. And they help us realize that spring is here, the blooms are about to arrive. The miller moths every year complete a migration as impressive as the monarch butterfly migration. And they are actually not that different from us. They're underway seeking shelter and seeking food and pollinating important crops along the way.
Yeah, so I kind of want to get into that a bit more. Now I feel like, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong here, that these Miller moths are fairly concentrated here in the Front Range. I anecdotally have not heard about them in a lot of other different places. Could you tell us a bit more about that migration, maybe why we're seeing more of them in Colorado compared to other spots?
Yeah, so miller moths are actually not exclusive to the state of Colorado. You will find them a little bit earlier in the year. You will find them in some of our more eastern neighbor states. They start their journey in the plains every year where they emerge as moths and they follow flowers. They, like other pollinators, will feed on flower nectar, so they move along following the blooms. They start in the plains where the flowers bloom first, and then they make their way up the mountains, as we like to do in search for wildflowers and blooms. And then the survivors of the summer will make their way back to the plains, lay their eggs, and then the cycle will start again. We do see so many of them concentrated along the Front Range because we are right in the middle of their migratory path. This is a path that they have completed for thousands of years. So it's actually quite a privilege to see them completing this very special journey.
That is definitely pretty cool. I gotta say that. So the reason we're seeing so many right now, and just want to kind of back things up and make sure I'm getting this right, because this is the important part of it. The reason why we're seeing so many of them right now is that we're kind of right in the middle of their migratory pattern, and we're getting our blooms right now, which means there's added moths to pollinate them, right? Is that essentially it?
Yes. So
Okay.
when we think of the word pollinator, we often think of butterflies and we think of bees. And pollinators are very special animals. Pollinators are the ones that help our plants thrive and reproduce by spreading pollen from one plant to another. So when we see flowers all around us, the flowers that benefit not just the rest of the ecosystem, but also us humans, this is the important work of pollinators. Moths are often the forgotten cousin of the butterfly, and they can be excellent and very important pollinators as well. Not just that, but in their migratory path, miller moths are a very important food source for a variety of life, including birds and even bears up in the mountains. And so they are quite high protein and they fuel the rest of the life that we love to see in our bird feeders and in our backyards. So they are the base of the food pyramid in the ecosystems right now. A lot of animals are feeding their young right now. The nests are full of baby birds, and this migration is what keeps so many of them alive.
So don't swat them, right?
I recommend being good neighbors towards our moths. They are not here to stay. They won't spend that long in the Front Range. So while it is quite an intense wave of moths, it is not long lasting. And we have to recognize as well that they have completed this migratory path for a really, really long time. And right now we have placed quite a few obstacles in their paths. Moths use celestial objects like the moon and the stars to navigate their ancestral migratory path. And our artificial lights can confuse them. So when we have so many shiny buildings and well-lit homes, the moths lose their way a little bit, and they might end up in our homes instead of in the blooms that they're supposed to follow. So we have attracted them into our spaces, and I think it is up to us to be good neighbors and know that they are here to benefit us as well. They carry a lot of the important work of plant and ecosystem health on their shoulders.
Okay. So essentially, our lights and our urban settings, which are obviously not, part of the nature for a long time, they essentially are confusing lights for these moths who are really looking for the light of the stars and the moon to guide them in a certain direction, correct?
Correct. The moth migratory system, or their way of perceiving the world, is quite sophisticated, but it is light-based. So the classic trope of a moth flying to the flame is often case true, that this is something that they would use as a guiding, a wayfinding highway. And when they see artificial light, they are attracted to them. And this is not an issue exclusive to moths. A lot of our nocturnal wildlife is often confused by our artificial lighting systems. So when we think of pollution, light pollution is definitely a big one to keep in mind. So turning off all unnecessary lights, especially during miller moth season, is one of those win-win situations. The moths will have an easier time along their migratory path. They are less likely to find their way into our bedrooms. And we can help all sorts of nocturnal life like bats and owls, moths, and even fireflies.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So you mentioned, and this got me a little excited, that they're not going to be here for that long. How long do they typically stick around for? When do you anticipate them going away?
So the peak of the moths in one particular place will last 2 to 3 weeks. So we are, of course, right now experiencing the peak, but by the end of the month, we can expect most of the moths to have moved to different spaces. So we'll have them through for a little bit, visiting our Front Range as tourists, visiting our blooms, helping our flowers, and then they will move on to the next place, making their way making the journey all the way up to the mountains.
Does our wet spring, the fact that we've had a lot of rain this spring, does that bloom more flowers and therefore attract more moths?
That's a great question. And generally, wetter springs are more conducive to a better miller moth season in the sense that they're not as concentrated in our urban spaces. So in strong drought years, we don't have as many blooms in the places that they should be. So moths generally concentrate in our artificially irrigated spaces like our backyards, our cities, our parks, and our homes. So we tend to see more conflict with miller moths in drought years. This being a wetter spring, if the blooms are better spread out, generally the moths will be better spread out as well.
Okay, that's interesting. I guess to that, following up on it, does the wildfire smoke affect the miller moths anyway, or no? Or is it too, I don't know.
That is a great question. So butterflies and moths generally are important indicators of ecosystem health. So as soon as big changes happen in the environment, like drought or decreased air quality, moths and butterflies are one of the first animals to respond to those changes meaningfully. While nothing has been done to study the response of wildfire smoke on miller moths, There have been studies that indicate that different butterflies that are migratory, like the painted lady, do suffer detrimental effects due to wildfire smoke. For example, the wildfire smoke particles, when they're dense enough, can essentially weigh those butterflies down and make their migratory path more difficult. So they fly slower, they hang out longer when they shouldn't, and it can even cause huge fatigue in the population. So thicker wildfire smoke might mean slower flying moths that hang around for longer. They can also get confused. So those sophisticated navigation systems we talked about can get a little bit kind of off balance. So they might have a harder time wayfinding. And in different places, like where we see high number of monarch butterflies overwintering, we have seen declines that correlate with wildfires. So we do know that butterflies and moths are quite sensitive to these big catastrophic environmental issues.
I have learned so much. I have probably a million more questions to base off of. Any other big things that we should know about Miller moths and how they affect our ecosystem here along the Front Range? I think most of us at this point know not to kill them, to be good neighbors, as you mentioned, and to bring them outside. But is there anything else that you think that we haven't touched on that we should mention here?
Yes, I do want to make clear once again that Miller moths are part of this very important group of animals called pollinators. And pollinators are not only responsible for the food that we eat, but even for the air that we breathe. So making sure to approach our fellow pollinators with less fear and more curiosity or even wonder will help us be better neighbors and more tolerant of their visit. And if you're having a harder time with that, come visit Butterfly Pavilion, learn more about them. This entire summer, we're hosting events that are pollinator specific. So you can come engage with bumblebees and butterflies and learn about the important work that they do. And it's also a great way to increase your toolkit, your survival toolkit for Miller moth season.
Absolutely. Butterfly Pavilion in Westminster, by the way, of course. So mentioned that. I guess I got one final question for you here, Sharon. What is your phone like this time of year? So are you getting nonstop questions from your friends about what is going on with these?
Oh, absolutely. It is one of my favorite times of year because suddenly everyone wants to know about moths. The rest of the year, people forget that moths are even a thing. But yes, I definitely feel popular this week.
Awesome. Well, Sharon Hershkovich, we really appreciate a few minutes of your time and for lending us so much of your expertise and about these kind of wonderful creatures. Honestly, I kind of want to go pet a moth right now and don't have to go too far away from one. But I'm sure some of you at home will have a different opinion on that. But anyways, go. By the way, a little fun fact that my fiance and I have learned is that if you take a coffee cup and you get a little piece of paper, something like that, you trap them in, you can take them outside pretty easily, and they'll go on their way. So for those of you at home looking for an easy way to not swat them and to be good neighbors, as you mentioned there, Sharon, just again, coffee cup, little piece of paper, take them outside, and they'll be on their way, right?
I love that tip, Chris. And generally, children tend to be excellent moth catchers. So if you want a fun entertainment strategy for your children at home, they tend to have a great time with it.
There you go. And tell them, of course, that they're good for the environment, so they shouldn't be swatting. But anyways, Sharon, thank you so much for taking a few minutes of your time and joining us here on 90s Plus today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.